remember that free will is intuitive. It's our starting point. We start with what we intuitively believe, and the skeptic of something, say like consciousness or free will, has to provide evidence that our intuitions are wrong on this.
This is what prompted me to want to include this particular clip.
Oh my.
Christians love intuition.
Wait. I want him to see your face right now. Look at
Yes,
IP's
we do.
face. This is what it
Yes, we
takes to
do.
get IP to smile.
I was so happy he said this. Yes, we love intuition. This was an accidental compliment to us because philosophers love intuition. I mean, I just got my master's in philosophy. We talked about it all the time. So, I mean, Thomas Nagel. Who else? David Brink. Is that the name I'm thinking of?
Mm-hmm.
No, Richard Boyd is who I'm thinking of, but David Brink as well as a determinist, Greg D. Caruso. Well, note that we often argue from intuitions. I took a class with Jonathan Weinberg. We read a lot of papers on intuition. We use intuition quite often. So the reason why we appeal to intuitions, I mean, he's just sort of saying that Christians are philosophically minded. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why it might appear to someone on the face of it like, hey, look, you're talking about common sense. And maybe he says that in the video. I don't want to put it on his lips. But it's not exactly the same thing. You might have common sense opinions that were developed in you over a long period of time. Intuitions are something I think even more fundamental or basic than that.
Well, let's play a little bit more of the clip and then we can define intuitions.
Sure, here we go.
I don't get why exactly. When you ask about objective morality, the answer to the evidence for objective morality is individual intuition. When you talk about consciousness, the answer is individual intuition. And when it comes to free will, again, the answer is individual intuition. And you heard Michael say just there, it is up to the skeptic or is up to someone else to disprove my intuition. Now, of course, that's something that's possible to do. Again, when it comes to like, my intuition is maybe that the earth is flat because it seems flat. Well, given enough evidence contrary to that, in terms of new information, you can convince someone that the earth is indeed round, even though it seems intuitive that it is flat. The trouble here is that my intuition is that we do not have free will. I've read books on this. I've read papers on this. I've thought about this. Pardon me. Sorry. Microphone. Distracted by my dog who's doing some kind of business over here that I hope will not affect the stream. Thank you, Bella. Pardon me. All right. So my intuition, of course, is that we do not have free will.
Okay.
So now Michael and I are
Okay, that's not an intuition. That's a reasonable conclusion he's come to from studying things. Intuitions are not conclusions. They're not reasons. They're not thoughts necessarily. So here's what Jonathan Weinberg and Joshua Alexander define it in Challenge of Sticking with Intuitions Through Thick and Thin, their paper. They say, like perceptions, philosophical intuitions provide a non-inferential defeasible justificationary foundation in at least the following way. A person may appeal to an intuition as evidence without having to provide further evidence for the intuition. Okay, that's just what intuitions are. I like the way Ruth Schaefer-Landau, again, who's another atheist, defines intuitions. He says this: intuition is not a belief, it's not a judgment or any other dosastic statement. It's not a tendency or a disposition to endorse a proposition. It's not a guess. It's not a hunch. It's not a supposition. It's not a faculty of any sort. Neither is it infallible. Neither is it epistemically justifiable or unjustifiable. It's a conscious experiential state that has content. Okay, so in a nutshell, what he's trying to say is intuitions are just sort of like the way we sort of act. Okay, we don't act as if determinism is true. Okay, we act as if we are conscious agents, that we are making our own choices, and that's how we live our life. We don't have to think about that. We just sort of do that. Beliefs, Schaefer-Landau notes, are formed either by accepting or building on intuitions or rejecting intuition. It seems like Paul has rejected his intuition of free will, And because he studied things, he's read things. So now he's got a different conclusion, but that's not his intuition. Intuitions don't really require thinking. We just sort of act on our intuitions without thinking. They're sort of like our intuitive. This is why I said in the video, they're our intuitive starting point. It's how we normally act. For example, I would say B theory of time is true, but intuition tells me A theory of time is true. That's my intuition. So my conclusion
Your intuitions
is
are correct there, Michael.
No, they're not. I would argue they're not. But I would not say I now have a different intuition. No, I still have the same intuition. That's how I act, as if A theory of time is the flow of time, and that's how things are, even though I have a different conclusion.
Yeah, like in other words, we're not insulting. Hopefully, it's not an insult to someone to say they're acting differently than what they've intuited, or to say that they, even though the intuition is there, their conclusions reflect what they think is actually true about reality in spite of their intuitions. This is like why you say they're not infallible in the list of all the things that the philosopher said that intuitions are, right?
Right.
Is that right? Yeah.
And even determinists will admit free will is intuitive. So Greg D. Caruso says we all subjectively feel that it is ultimately up to us what we choose and who we act, and that we could have chosen or acted otherwise than we did in fact. When we look within ourselves at our ability to act on those choices, we feel ourselves to be directly aware of our freedom. This strong sense of freedom leads us to believe that we have free will. So here's a determinist admitting that intuitively we think we have free will, and then he goes on to argue against free will. But that's not a change of his intuition. That's a different conclusion. Richard Boyd says, in the sciences, we decide between theories on the basis of observations, which have an important degree of objectivity. It appears that our moral reasoning, moral intuitions play the same role which observations do in science. So he also says, like, intuitions are vital in philosophy. That's how we reason from certain things, decide if they're wrong or right. Thomas Nagel, another atheist, relies on intuitions to argue against subjectivists, people that are skeptical of logic. It's like you have to sort of move me from my intuitions. It's not my job to prove they're true. It's your job, the skeptic, to sort of push me away from there. So when you dive into philosophy, they're always appealing to intuitions, and they're defining what we mean by intuitions. It's not this idea of like a reasonable conclusion, which Paul is talking about. It's fine that he has come to the conclusion that he thinks determinism is true. Fine, but that's not what an intuition is.
Yeah, well, that's all really good stuff. And it makes me think of, I heard you once responding to someone on a video somewhere and pointing this out, that, look, if you're going to do moral thinking, if you're going to consider morality, you kind of have to look inward. You kind of have to, it's something that you know because you know what it's like to be a conscious agent and consider morality, right?
Well, I think with the moral argument and a lot of other things, because sometimes people will show instances where intuitions can turn out to be wrong, they want to toss out intuition as a category that can have any validity towards any sort of subject. And I think that's a grave mistake. And I don't think that the philosophers you're talking about go that far and try to say, well, because some of our intuitions about the nature of reality can be wrong, therefore we have to toss out intuition altogether and just, move on without it. I think that's a mistake, because I think our intuitions about a lot of things in a lot of areas turn out to be right. Because like you said, intuition is kind of the way that you act. And I would say also react to things because you intuit certain things to be offensive or pleasant or pleasing or whatever, and that's kind of your orientation. So I think this idea, let's find some places where intuition has turned out to be wrong as a means to dismiss any arguments that begin with intuition. I think that's an error.
So let's keep trucking.
Let's keep going through the clip, because Paul says something here that is kind of ironic.
In competing intuitions, and that doesn't mean anything. I can't say, hey, Michael, you have to disprove my intuition. That doesn't help at all. We have to look to other methods. So I feel like intuition is one of the worst ways of knowing things. Theists seem to think it is the best way of knowing things, and that they seem justified in following their intuition as long as they don't have something really convincingly counter. I suppose that is probably how we all operate. I'm probably operating the same way when it comes to the non-falsifiable free will. I'm following my intuition that we don't have it. Just straight up appealing to intuition isn't going to solve anything.
I don't think this.
Do you want to let me play your response, Michael? Or do you
No,
want to respond to
you
this first?
You can go through. It's just funny to me because he's just saying we're philosophically minded because atheist philosophers, like I've quoted, are always using intuitions. They're always building on our intuitions. Like that's what we use in philosophy. It's a key part of it.
And I think he's going to address this more in a minute. But he's basically said, I don't have this intuition that you have.
But
Michael.
He's confusing his conclusion about something he has looked into with intuition, as you explained earlier, the difference. And so it's not a case of your intuition that we have free will versus his intuition, which is really more of an informed decision that he's made to accept a particular conclusion that's opposite of the intuition that you would say that you have about, or that people have in general about free will. So I think
that's what he admitted. He admitted that he studied and he read books and he came to the conclusion. That's not his intuition. That's his conclusion.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's.
Okay. But I mean, sometimes we get in trouble for telling people what they might intuit. So I just want to say, is it possible that having formed that conclusion, is it possible that he now intuits determinism because he's more convinced of it? Or
I don't think that. Let me just use the analogy of A theory and B theory of time again. I think B theory of time is true. That's the conclusion I have. But I still act as if A theory of time is true. Like I cannot act as if like I'm all in these different blocks of time spread out across my entire life and just go. I have to live my life as if A theory of time is true. There's moral subjectivists, there's moral anti-realists out there, but they still live as if morality is objective because we can't. That's just our intuition, even if you reject it. Same with free will. If like I got arrested and I was a determinist, I can't say, well, no, my chemistry determined me, so I'm not guilty. No, the way our society is going to work and the way I'm going to act is if I am the one who is responsible for that. So even if you philosophically reject some of these conclusions, we still are going to intuit and act that certain way because that's the intuitions we build off.
So perhaps the confusion comes a bit with the common repeated refrain, I intuitively know a particular thing, which can be legitimate, I think, but you're using you're defining intuition in a way that is, I think, maybe different slightly from how Paul thinks of it. Paul is thinking of, I think, when someone is saying they intuit something, it seems to me that what he's saying is, this is the way it really strongly seems to me. And he's saying it seems to me otherwise. Whereas you're saying, look, however you function, however you have to live, seems like it reflects the intuitive nature that you're experiencing.
Yeah, so the determinist likes chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream, but when he walks into the ice cream store,
he functions as though he's a libertine.
As if he's going to make a choice, and he's not going to go through what are my chemicals telling me, and what in the history of my entire life has led up to. No, he's like, I feel like vanilla today, and that's the end of how that works.
Yeah, Paul might be using it more in a colloquial sense, and I'm trying to. When I talk about intuitions, I'm typically using it in a more philosophically rigorous sense.
Yeah. All right, let's keep trucking.
Skeptic has presented enough evidence that free will is an error. I think we do have free will, and the fact that we are conscious beings means we are self-aware. We're able to think and process information, unlike non-sentient things out there.
So sentience has absolutely nothing to do with free will. I mean, they may seem tangentially connected. You probably need to have sentience in order to have free will if you believe in free will. But the fact that we are conscious, the fact that other creatures have levels of consciousness, again, doesn't mean that they have a libertarian free will, where the inputs could produce different results.
So I would disagree there. I'd follow the philosopher Roderick Chisholm, who says we must not say that every event involved in the act is caused by some other event. We must not say that the act is something that is not caused at all. The possibility that remains there is this. We should say that at least one of the events that are involved in the act is caused, but not by any other event, but by something else instead. And this something else can only be the agent, the man. So he directly argues that conscious agents are different than non-sentient processes. We're not random. We're not determined. We are conscious, and consciousness is unlike anything else in existence. And so you can't judge it like you would judge non-sentient processes. And he argues one of the foundational aspects of consciousness is the ability to determine their own choices, to bring in different influences, inputs, and be the final decider of these things. So I think sentience is, if you're a sentient conscious agent, that entails having the ability to do free will as it's properly understood.
Yeah, I mean, that works for me. Jonathan, any thoughts?
No, I was distracted by your thing.
Today I'm
Was
off.
your phone?
I'm off.
Your phone?
I'm off today.
Yes.
I'm beholding the glory of IP. All right, let's go back and keep this party rolling.
No, again, non sequitur.
I think it's just natural that conscious beings have free will, and I argue from my intuition on that. If I'm wrong, the skeptic needs to show me why my intuition is wrong. It's not my job to show that my intuition is true. Technically speaking, they need to show.
Again, I don't think that's correct. That's a whole burden of proof shift. If I'm
Here, he's saying it's the burden of proof.
Yeah, I have a problem with that because if I'm just operating on my daily life on my intuitions, and you want to tell me that my intuitions are wrong, it's not a shift of burden. I'm happy thinking I have free will and deciding.
You came along and ruined my day with this determinism.
Right. You better present your case.
Yeah.
It's not. Oh, it's my job to convince you that.
I'm imagining you walking down the street here in Evansville and somebody harasses you and says, determinism is true. And now you're like, well, now I got to deal with this.
Or the obnoxious philosophy undergrad major that works at the ice cream store.
And just discovered the conversation.
Yeah, and is bothering me about my indecision about which way am I going to go on vanilla. And then when I have a conversation about determinism, I'm like, okay, well, I think I have free will, but give it your best shot. I'm not. For him to come back and say, no, you proved to me that you have free will, that you can, libertarianly choose the vanilla over the, no, buddy, just give me the ice cream
Yeah, good point. Tell us about the book, IP.
So Thomas Nagel is not talking about free will. He's talking about logic and skeptics of logic in here. He's got a pretty good quote. He says, claims to the effect that a type of judgment expresses a local point of view are inherently objective intent. They suggest a picture of true sources of the judgment, which places them in an unconditional context. The judgment of relativity and conditional cannot be applied to the judgment of relativity itself. To put it more bluntly, everything is subjective must be nonsense, for it would itself have to be either subjective or objective. And then he goes on to argue, look, if you want to argue that everything is subjective, you're assuming that there are objective truths. The burden is on you to sort of get rid of this intuition we have, because you're assuming it in your attack on objectivity. So to borrow from him, he's basically pointing out the same principles we see in epistemic particularism, which is the philosophy that if the skeptic is going to come and attack something, the burden is on the skeptic to show the intuition on it is wrong, because they're the one making the claim that goes against our intuition on this. They have to show it is wrong. It's not us to prove what we already intuit to be true, or already have as our starting point. The skeptic has to do it with logic, free will, and you could argue that there can be a case for determinism, sure, but they have to do with moral realism, all these things. It's not on us to do this, and this is one of the things Nagel lays out in his book in regards to logic.
Well, and in addition to that, you said you don't actually exactly argue it this way, but I like to take some of Swinburne and some of Craig here. And in Craig's moral argument, take it or leave it, but the second premise that objective moral values and duties do exist, in defense of that premise, what he will do is sometimes he will say something like, listen, and this is where the Swinburne type reasoning comes in. Look, if I have an intuition that seems to me almost impossible to deny, not that it is impossible, but almost impossible to deny, then it seems like any argument that is brought, the premises in that argument will be less convincing to me than the immediate experience I have of, say, morality. And it's not that can't be overcome, but it's just to point out the strength of this. And I presented it that way with respect to free will in my debate with Matt Dillahunty and maybe with Dan Barker. And I think that it makes some sense. Look, boots on the ground, if I'm a person who claims to experience this free will and intuits it very strongly, if we're talking about convincing me, then you're going to need to give me an argument that is more powerful in terms of convincing someone of things than my own immediate access to it. Mm-hmm. And so that's my thoughts about that. Ready to move forward?
Yeah, in the sense of you may be wrong, but in the sense of
You have to show me I'm wrong.
Yeah, burden of proof. Yeah, it's not.
So I need an argument with a premise in that argument that's more compelling than my
Right.
immediate experience.
And that's not even a shift in the burden of proof. It's just like, what?
All right, let's keep trucking now.